he stood in a borrowed palace and felt, for once, the awkwardness of victory. In the Kremlin, on an October morning when the light comes late and thin, Napoleon listened to the city's silence as if it were an accusation. The gilded domes beyond the window were dulled by smoke. The streets below, once imagined as the grand stage where Russia would be compelled to kneel, were emptier than the boulevards of a plague. A courier arrived with the day's arithmetic. So many horses dead for want of fodder, so many wagons lost on roads that were not roads but ruts and mud, so many men straggling behind, living on whatever could be scraped from a countryside that had learned to become barren on command. He read, and the emperor who had made Europe a chessboard found himself staring at a different game. Not the geometry of battlefields, but the slow, unromantic tyranny of distance and cold. It is tempting to say that Napoleon's worst decision was the invasion itself, and in the moral ledger that may be true. Yet history, if it is honest, seldom condemns with a single stroke. Great follies ripen. They have antecedents in policy, temperament, and the applause of success. Napoleon did not wake one morning seized by madness and march to Moscow. He moved, as many rulers have moved, from necessity to choice, from choice to habit, and from habit to the illusion that the world was obliged to behave as it had behaved before. The catastrophe of 1812 was not merely a clash of armies, it was a collision between a man's method and a continent's scale, between the logic of conquest and the physics of supply. By 1812 he had become, in the European imagination, the embodiment of irresistible momentum. He had learned to strike quickly, to live off the land, to compel surrender with the fall of capitals and the shattering of armies. Italy had yielded, Austria had bargained, Prussia had bowed, and even the old Spanish ulcer, bloody, stubborn, humiliating, had not yet persuaded him that time could defeat genius. Success had trained him as one trains an animal. Reward followed boldness. The habit became a philosophy. Where older kings had husbanded resources and waited for alliances, he moved like an engineer of fate, confident that the decisive battle was always available and that political obedience would follow military brilliance. But Russia was not a European state in the manner he understood Europe. Its distances were not the distances of Germany. Its roads were not roads, but seasonal permissions granted by weather. Its wealth was not concentrated in the kind of towns that could feed an army by simple requisition. Above all, its strategy was not to save cities, but to save the state. If Napoleon was the heir of Caesar in swiftness, Russia in 1812 was the heir of Scythia in patience. It would trade space for time until the invader's muscles failed. Napoleon's grievance was not trifling. The continental system, his attempt to throttle Britain by closing European ports, required compliance from every coast and every ally. Russia's commerce and pride could not be indefinitely sacrificed to a French blockade that enriched smugglers and impoverished merchants. As Tsar Alexander drifted away from full cooperation, Napoleon felt an empire loosening at its edges. The logic of his system was coercive. If one great power could defect without consequence, others would follow. He had built, with astonishing speed, a European order that depended upon his ability to punish dissent. So he resolved to punish. The decision had the clean simplicity that appeals to rulers. March east, strike the Russian army, take a grand prize, force peace. He assembled the Grande Armée, an army less French than imperial, with Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen, and others, a moving parliament of conquered peoples. On paper it was immense, a river of men. On the ground it was a problem of bread, oats, boots, and time. Here the sober historian must pause, because the romance of campaigns hides its true machinery. Armies do not live on laurels, they live on calories and animals. Each soldier is a stomach, Each gun is a beast of burden. Each mile is an expenditure. Napoleon's earlier victories had been aided by dense, cultivated regions where an army could requisition food, forage, and shelter. In Russia, the villages were fewer, the fields more sparse, and the people more willing, under pressure or patriotism, to burn what they could not carry. Moreover, the farther the army marched, the longer the thin line of supply became, stretching back toward depots that could not move and roads that could dissolve in rain. Napoleon had not ignored logistics. He had, in his manner, tried to master them. Depots were established, wagons were gathered, plans were made. But planning is not feeding. A supply system is not a list of intentions, but a constant struggle against theft, mud, broken wheels, exhausted horses, and the simple fact that what can be carried is always less than what is needed. The Grande Armée began the campaign with a confidence that was itself a kind of ration. It convinced men they would soon eat well again. That confidence did not survive the first weeks. From the moment the army crossed into Russian lands, the landscape became an accomplice of resistance. The Russians retreated, avoiding the decisive engagement Napoleon craved, drawing him onward like a gambler coaxing a rival to raise the stakes. Men began to drop from heat, disease, and hunger even before winter arrived, an early hint of a truth that empires learn too late. Climate is not merely cold, it is time itself, measured in human weakness. Napoleon's mind was built for the climax. His genius was tactical, operational. He could shift corps like pieces and appear where he was least expected. But a campaign in Russia did not offer a single climax. It offered an attrition that hid its victory until it was too late to retreat. The Russians, by withdrawing, were not conceding. They were insisting that the war be fought on Russia's terms. Every day, without decisive battle, was a victory of strategy over tactics. When at last the Russian army stood at Borodino, it did so not as a surrender, but as a sacrifice. The battle was one of the bloodiest of its age, a grinding slaughter in which Napoleon's army gained ground at immense cost, and yet failed to annihilate its opponent. It was, in the military sense, a victory. In the political sense, it was a warning. Napoleon had won his entry ticket to Moscow, but not the peace that was supposed to follow such a triumph. Moscow then became the obsession. Napoleon marched toward it as if toward a talisman. In Europe, the capture of a capital was often the capture of the state's will. He had taken Vienna more than once. He had entered Berlin. He had treated capitals as levers that moved monarchs. Moscow was not, in Russia's administrative reality, the same lever. St. Petersburg was the seat of government. Yet Moscow was the heart in the national imagination. Napoleon, whose own rise had been intertwined with symbols and spectacle, assumed that taking Russia's heart would compel its head to reason. When he entered Moscow, he entered a city that had chosen absence as its defense. The inhabitants had fled, the stores were emptied, and soon the city was on fire. Whether the burning was ordered, encouraged, or merely permitted by chaos, it achieved the same end. It made conquest useless. Here was the paradox that haunted him in the Kremlin. He had reached the goal and found it hollow. He could not feed his army on ashes. He could not negotiate with an enemy who refused to be present. And here, in that smoky, vacant triumph, lies the decision that deserves to be called his worst, not because it was the only error, but because it was the moment when ambition visibly outran reality. He stayed. He stayed in Moscow for weeks, waiting for the letter that would allow him to end the campaign with dignity. He stayed because retreat felt to his temperament like confession. He stayed because he believed that the capture of a sacred city must, by the logic of history, produce submission. He stayed because he could not yet accept that his opponent had chosen a different logic, not to bargain, but to endure. The soldier's body is honest, even when the ruler's mind is not. As Napoleon waited, the weather turned. The days shortened, the nights sharpened. Horses died in greater numbers, and with each horse the army lost not only a beast, but a function: artillery that could not move, wagons that could not carry, officers who could not ride. The starving horse is a tragedy that becomes a statistic, but that statistic becomes destiny. Without horses, the army became heavier and slower, and slowness in Russia is the beginning of death. Napoleon did eventually give the order to leave, but the date mattered. In Russia, the calendar is not a bureaucratic measure, it is a tactical weapon. An army can survive hunger for a time, but cold is hunger's accelerant. Napoleon's delay meant that when he began the retreat, the margins were gone. He was no longer choosing among good options, he was selecting the least disastrous from a menu of calamities. Retreat is not merely walking backward, it is a different kind of war, one that tests discipline more cruelly than battle. In advance, men will endure hardship for the hope of progress. In retreat, hardship feels like futility. The Russian army, the Cossacks, the partisans, and the very villages became predators upon the withdrawing column. The road Napoleon had taken to Moscow had been stripped bare. Now he was forced to march back along a corridor of ruin, through towns already ravaged, across fields already harvested or burned, into a countryside that had learned to offer nothing. There were moments when alternative routes were considered, turning south toward regions less devastated, seeking winter quarters in areas that might still provide food. But war is a chain of constraints. The enemy blocks one road, the mud devours another, the need to protect the wounded and the artillery slows every move, and the simple fact remains that a starving army cannot march like a healthy one. When he tried to shift toward the south, he found resistance and the fear of being cut off. He was forced back toward the path of his own destruction. Then the winter arrived not as a single event, but as a creeping occupation of the body. It took fingers first, then toes, then the will. Men fell asleep and did not wake. Powder became unreliable, metal seized, bread froze. The army disintegrated into a long, desperate crowd, still wearing the names of regiments, but no longer possessing their cohesion. In such circumstances, heroism is not a trumpet call. It is a man holding his place in line, an officer trying to keep a company together, a peasant refusing to surrender the last sack of grain because he knows his children will die without it. Napoleon's genius, which had once seemed a kind of providence, could not outmaneuver frost. He could still issue orders, still arrange crossings, still salvage fragments of artillery, but the fundamental equation could not be altered. Too many mouths, too little food, too long a distance, too hostile a landscape, too late a season. Logistics, which in victory is invisible, now became the only story. Men do not die in their thousands because a general lacks courage. They die because the system that sustains life collapses. The crossing of the Berezina, often remembered as a feat of desperate engineering and courage, was also a symbol of the campaign's meaning. Bridges were built under fire, men surged and screamed, wagons toppled, water and ice claimed those who could not keep moving. It was the end of the retreat's last illusion that there remained some orderly salvation ahead. Those who crossed did so not as a triumphant army, but as survivors of a natural disaster. When Napoleon finally left the remnants of his forces and hurried westward, he did what rulers do. He returned to the political center, to the place where power is repaired. He could still command, he could still raise new armies, he could still make Europe tremble for a time. But something had changed in the world's psychology. The myth of invincibility had been punctured, and in politics a punctured myth bleeds quickly. Allies become hesitant, enemies become brave, neutral states lean away. Russia had not merely defended itself, it had altered the balance of imagination. What, then, was the worst decision? If one insists on a single moment, it was the decision to treat Moscow as a negotiator, to sit in its burned grandeur and wait for a peace that would not come, while the calendar turned against him. It was the choice to believe that the capture of a symbol could substitute for the destruction of an enemy's capacity to fight. It was the refusal, born of pride and habit, to recognize that in Russia the decisive battle was not Borodino, not Moscow, not even the Berezina, but the slow duel between an army's needs and a nation's willingness to deny them. Yet behind that moment lay a deeper habit, Napoleon's faith in his own momentum. He had come to think that history rewarded audacity as a law, not as a contingency. He had been so often right that he mistook his pattern for nature's pattern. He had forgotten that the world is not obliged to be intelligible to one mind, however brilliant. The winter, in this sense, was not an accident. It was the world's reminder that reality has its own schedule. There is a melancholy lesson here, larger than any single emperor. Human ambition is a noble engine. It builds roads, laws, sciences, and cities. It also builds catastrophes when it outruns the humble calculations that keep life possible. We like to believe that great men fall because of moral flaws, pride, cruelty, vanity, and often they do. But they also fall because of mathematics, distances, supplies, temperatures, time. The body of history is made of such numbers, and the soul of history is the refusal to honor them. Napoleon's campaign in Russia reads, in retrospect, like a tragedy whose ending was written in its first act. The army crosses a border too far from home. The enemy retreats. The land empties. The weather waits. It is all so plain to those who know the ending. But to those inside the story, the ending is invisible until it becomes inevitable. That is why folly is so common and wisdom so rare. The future does not announce itself. In the Kremlin that October morning, Napoleon could still imagine a letter arriving, a treaty signed, a march home with drums and banners. He could still see himself, as he had so many times before, converting military movement into political submission. But outside his window the smoke lingered in the cold air, and the city he had taken refused to be useful. Somewhere beyond Moscow, in the forests and open fields, winter was assembling its quiet army, an army that required no pay, no commissariat, no orders, and never deserted. When at last he accepted that Moscow would not yield peace, it was already yielding something else, time. And time, in Russia, is the most faithful ally of those who are willing to suffer longer than their enemy can. Napoleon had wagered that ambition could bend that ally to his will. He lost, not because he lacked brilliance, but because brilliance cannot feed men, cannot conjure fodder, cannot turn mud into roads, cannot keep blood warm in a freezing night. So the campaign ends, as all overreaches end, not with a single dramatic mistake, but with a slow accumulation of neglected realities. The emperor who had mastered Europe met a country that refused to be mastered by his methods. In that collision between will and world, between symbol and supply, the human story repeats one of its oldest truths. The distance between desire and consequence is often measured in